Somalia. Our guest is well equipped to handle questions covering the continent of Africa and American policy there, but we've asked him to focus on Somalia tonight, a question of great interest to everybody who's curious about failed states and their complications, but probably more dramatically, everyone interested in the possibility of establishing al-Qaeda bases, the questions of radical Islam, and the difficulties of trying to cope with that particular front of the war on terrorism is hugely interesting. And of course, we rely upon our guest, whose wisdom we respect in this area, to deal with the questions which he thinks are most important. Mr. Lampton, who I mentioned earlier, is dean at SAIS. Mr. Swan has his master's degree in international relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. After having graduated from Georgetown, he also has a master's degree from the National War College, where he graduated with distinction. He's a career Foreign Service officer. Among his postings, which have, and by the way, I should emphasize that he's primarily dealt with complex regimes in a period of transition, especially in Africa. And he's had numerous assignments, but those which were Africa-oriented primarily include having been Somali observer while in Kenya, and political officer in Cameroon. He was Deputy Chief of Mission in the Republic of Congo and the Deputy Chief of Mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for which he also, in an earlier stage, was the desk officer back at the State Department. Before assuming his present post, he was Director of Analysis of African Affairs in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, which is a wonderful opportunity to grasp the big picture. And at present, he is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. In that position, he has responsibilities for 3 offices: the Office for East Africa, the Office for Central Africa, and the Office for Regional Security Affairs. It's a fascinating area of the world. It's awfully important to American policy presently and in the future. It's my great pleasure to present the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Mr. Swan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Byrd, for that introduction and for welcoming me here tonight. I apologize for the slight delay in my arrival due to the snowy conditions in Washington. It makes me yearn for the dry heat of Mogadishu. But I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak with you tonight on the topic that was suggested to me, which is Somalia. And I know there's already been a great deal of recent attention devoted to this subject in U.S. and international media. But I think in many ways Somalia still remains quite unknown to a lot of Americans. And in my view, there have really been 2 occasions when Somalia has attracted broad attention within the United States. One, the 1970s with the 1977-78 Ogaden War. And our interest at that time, frankly, was largely to view Somalia in the context of superpower competition. And I suspect many of you in the room will remember National Security Advisor Brzezinski's trenchant comment that the strategic arms negotiations with the Soviets were buried in the sands of the Ogaden. And at that time, we were very much interested in Somalia, but again, more in the context of Cold War competition. Americans also, of course, vividly recall the 1992 U.S.-led humanitarian intervention in Somalia and the subsequent confrontation that we had with the Mogadishu warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid, particularly after his forces killed some 24 Pakistani peacekeepers in June of 1993. and ultimately the downing of 2 U.S. helicopters and the deaths of some 18 U.S. Servicemen not only had significant policy implications in terms of affecting the way the United States approached peacekeeping operations subsequently, but also I think has left some significant emotional scars in many ways on the United States that continues to influence our attitudes towards Somalia and the developments in Somalia. And now, more recently, developments over the past 18 months have once again focused attention on Somalia. First, as a consequence of the rapid rise of the Islamic Courts Council, and subsequently as a consequence of their even more rapid demise at the hands of an Ethiopian military intervention in support of the Somali transitional institutions and Somali transitional government military forces. So to help put these developments in context, what I'd like to do tonight is first of all outline what we see as U.S. interests in Somalia, then provide a little bit of historical background as to what happened leading up to developments in 2006, then devote considerable time to an assessment of events over the past year or so, and finally describe the U.S. government's very active policy response to the current situation. And just briefly to preview the conclusion, our policy is designed to seize what we see as the first real opportunity in many years to help Somalis rebuild their country and restore effective governance that's representative of all aspects of Somali society. And our response to this opportunity can and will be purposeful. As many of you know, Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, Jendai Fraser, my boss, has made 2 trips to the Horn of Africa since the beginning of January in support of our efforts to achieve lasting stability in Somalia. I think if there's one lesson that she took away from her trip to the Horn of Africa, her trips to the Horn of Africa, it's this, that the Somali people are ready for peace, they're tired of war, and while the transitional governing institutions are not yet ready to stand entirely on their own, they offer a very promising vehicle for a way forward to Somalia, and the United States is committed to supporting that effort. So first, let me talk a little bit about U.S. interests in Somalia, which, of course, drive our goals and our policy with respect to that country. Somalia has been the world's clearest example of a failed state since 1991, when the government collapsed, and I'll come to that in a moment. This condition threatens our broader interests in regional stability in the Horn of Africa. Somalia sits at the crossroads of sub-Saharan Africa and the Near East, and the overall security of the region is affected by Somalia's continued lack of internal stability. And frankly, the Horn is already a fragile region, or certainly has been historically. Fragile in terms of its physical environment, fragile in terms of the people's livelihoods, fragile in terms of security. As an example, Somalia has the longest coastline in Africa, and with the lack of effective governance in Somalia, this has contributed to an upsurge in offshore piracy recently. More broadly, Somalia's status as a failed state has undercut U.S. longer-term foreign policy objectives, including a promotion of democracy and economic development in the region. And most dramatically, of course, Somalia's ungoverned spaces opened opportunities for terrorists who directly threatened U.S. persons and facilities in the area. Al-Qaeda East Africa members responsible for the August 1998 bombings of U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam found refuge in Somalia. So did individuals responsible for the bombing of an Israeli-owned hotel in Mombasa, Kenya, and an attempted missile attack on an Israeli airliner, both in 2002. And as we'll see later, the opportunities afforded these terrorist elements increased significantly in Somalia during the period of the expanded control of the Islamic Courts Council in southern Somalia. So in keeping with these interests which I've outlined, our goals in Somalia are to help Somalis secure their country, move forward with a process of inclusive dialogue and reconciliation, and begin reconstruction. If this sounds like a massive undertaking in what has recently been a failed state, it is. And I think at this point, I would like to provide a little bit of historical background to let you know. I realize many of you are deeply familiar with this already, but just to review quickly some of the history as to how we got to this point. Prior to independence, most of present-day Somalia was ruled by the Italians, although the northwest was run by the British. And as in many African countries, independence ushered in a contentious period of democratic competition that was fairly abruptly brought to a close with a coup d'etat in 1969 that brought to power Major General Mohammed Siad Barre. Siad Barre ruled brutally and increasingly concentrated power in the hands of his Marihan clansmen during his rule. He asserted irredentist claims to territories of Somalia, or what he claimed were territories of Somalia in neighboring countries with large Somali populations. These include, obviously, Kenya, Djibouti, and Ethiopia. Initially, he operated within the orbit of the Soviet Union. However, he switched to the Western camp after Ethiopia allied with the Soviet Union following a coup d'etat in Ethiopia in 1974. And the Soviets then helped the Ethiopians score a decisive victory in the Ogaden War in 1977-78. I mentioned that earlier in my remarks. So by the end of the 1980s, disaffected members of other clans, non-Marihan, had taken up arms against Siad Barre's government, first in the north, especially in the former British area of British Somaliland, but later spreading to the central and southern regions of the country. Hundreds of thousands of Somalis fled Somalia, claimed refugee status in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, in Kenya. The Somali National Army disintegrated, and members rejoined their respective clan militias. Siad Barre's effective territorial control by the late 1980s was reduced to Mogadishu, and he came to be ridiculed really, as the mayor of Mogadishu in the final years of his regime. In January 1991, these opposition militia forces succeeded in driving Siad Barre out of power and resulting in the complete collapse of the central government. The year after, in response to continued political chaos and a rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation, the United States and other nations launched Operation Restore Hope. Under a unified task force known as UNITAF, this operation was designed to respond to the humanitarian emergency and create conditions in which the Somali population could recover from this disaster. UNITAF was followed by the United Nations operation in Somalia, UNISOM, and the United States played a significant role in both operations until it withdrew completely in 1994. The UN finally pulled out its troops in the spring of 1995, with Somalia still lacking a central government in any sort of national governance. And following the fall of Siad Barre in 1991, Somalia has largely been divided among clan-based fiefdoms, many of them dominated by strongmen from a particular region. Some regions have pursued more formal governing structures. In the northeast, a region known as Puntland, it established a quasi-autonomous government that has enjoyed relatively greater stability than in many other parts of Somalia. And perhaps most notably, the former British territory declared its independence in 1991. And although it is unrecognized by any other government, Somaliland has held elections, it has issued its own currency and travel documents, and it has sought to distance itself from the insecurity prevailing in other regions of Somalia. But in the capital, Mogadishu, the city was carved into neighborhoods controlled effectively by subclan-based warlords. And in part as a result of the insecurity that this arrangement afforded, and as a result of the impunity of the warlords and their militiamen, by the mid-1990s we began to see a phenomenon of so-called Islamic courts, local Islamic courts, that were established by some communities to provide very basic justice and some simple governance and administration for the population in Mogadishu. And over time, these courts acquired their own militias, militia forces, and effectively became the local authorities in many communities within Greater Mogadishu. These courts were a mixed bag, but some leaders of some of the courts had extremist tendencies and harbored individuals affiliated with Al-Qaeda's East Africa cell. By early 2006, Mogadishu was essentially divided into zones controlled by warlords and zones controlled by the courts. This is not to say that there was no effort during this period, this long period, beginning in 1991, to establish a more normal government in Somalia. There were more than a dozen efforts after the fall of Siad Barre to negotiate among the contenders in Somalia to form a new national government. The latest of these was a 2-year reconciliation process led by the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is a Horn of Africa-based organization. This initiative concluded in 2004 with the formation of a transitional government that has the objective of organizing elections in 2009. This government was formed under what's known as the Transitional Federal Charter and includes a transitional parliament as well as a president, Abdullahi Yusuf, prime minister, currently Prime Minister Gedi, and a cabinet. But following its formation in 2004, the transitional government lacked broad legitimacy, in part because it did not have widespread representation, including from some key groups in Mogadishu that did not feel they were sufficiently represented in the leadership councils of the TFG, of the transitional federal government. So this essentially brings us to the situation that existed in early 2006. A period, 15 years of state collapse, a country largely divided among various clan-based fiefdoms, a transitional federal government that has a certain degree of legitimacy but lacks broad-based consensus around its influence and was certainly unable to govern effectively at that point, and an Islamic courts movement that controlled certain areas of Mogadishu with its own militia forces and serving as de facto authorities in some neighborhoods of the capital. Now, beginning in early 2006, there were increased clashes between Mogadishu-based warlords, some of them grouped in a loose coalition known as the Alliance for Peace and Combat Against Terrorism, and the Islamic Courts militias, who became known at that point as the Union of Islamic Courts. The warlords steadily lost ground in these clashes, and by early June had been driven completely out of Mogadishu. The Islamic courts at this point were ascendant. Despite issuing an initial statement, the Islamic courts, calling for dialogue and peace, the court militia moved quickly to attack and capture another city outside Mogadishu called Johar, where the transitional federal government's cabinet had been based. And over the next 3 months, the Islamic courts militias gradually extended their control over much of southern Somalia. Now, from the beginning, the United States recognized that the courts were not monolithic. And we hoped very much for the emergence of moderates within the court's leadership. At the time, for example, we were very much encouraged by a June 22, 2006 agreement between the Somali Transitional Federal Institutions and the then Union of Islamic Courts. The U.S. supported this agreement, which came to be known as the Khartoum Declaration, where it was brokered. This agreement included points of mutual recognition between the transitional federal institutions and the Islamic courts, and also called for a cessation of hostilities. For a time, the Islamic courts also appeared to be able to establish greater security in Mogadishu and in other areas that they controlled. But while negotiations between the transitional government and the Islamic courts initially offered great promise, by late July, the Islamic courts' actions were beginning to counter both the spirit and reality of dialogue and to lead to further violence. Immediately after the Khartoum Declaration, the Union of Islamic Courts renamed itself the Council of Islamic Courts, and Hassan Dahir Awais was elected as the chairman of the Islamic Courts Consultative Council. Hassan Dahir Awais had been designated previously by both the United States and by the United Nations as a terrorist. On July 19, 2006, the Council of Islamic Courts also sought to provoke Ethiopia into a broader conflict by advancing toward the interim capital of Baidoa. And in succeeding months, extremist elements within the Council of Islamic Courts, particularly a group that came to be known as the Al-Shabaab, the youth movement, a radical movement within the overall organization, hijacked the broader courts movement and pushed the Council of Islamic Courts increasingly toward an agenda of military expansion and aggression. Despite international efforts, including our own, to encourage dialogue between the Islamic courts and the transitional federal institutions, the Islamic courts chose repeatedly to violate the terms of the Khartoum Declaration by, for example, bombing the Parliament building in Baidoa on September 18, taking over the port city of Kismayo on September 24th, and increasing their military presence near other areas such as Puntland and Baidoa, the transitional parliament's seat. Moreover, in November of 2006, the court's leadership reasserted irredentist Somali claims to a greater Somalia, including areas of Kenya and Ethiopia. Ethiopia, which was already a strong supporter of the transitional federal government, provided additional military trainers and other support to that government. These were decisive moments. Ultimately, the Council of Islamic Courts miscalculated. Probing attacks by the Council of Islamic Courts near Baidoa provoked the transitional federal government and its Ethiopian supporters to launch a counteroffensive against the Council of Islamic Courts on December 24th. Within a week, even although the Council had been effectively ascendant for some months prior to that, within a week the Council of Islamic Courts had been pushed back, their militia had abandoned Mogadishu, and by January 1st no longer controlled any city in Somalia. The Council of Islamic Court structure evaporated more quickly than anyone had anticipated. They suffered from both strategic and tactical failures, such as attempting to challenge superior Ethiopian conventional forces on open ground outside Baidoa and again near the town of Jilib. The courts were also weakened immensely by the withdrawal of popular support from the Somali people. The extremist elements within the Council of Islamic Courts very clearly did not reflect the will of Somalis as represented by civil society and their government. So where are we now? We see the current situation in Somalia very much as an opportunity. To capitalize on this opportunity, the United States has moved quickly to engage Somalia's various stakeholders and regional governments. This approach is in keeping with Secretary Rice's transformational diplomacy initiative. The U.S. strategy for Somalia includes three main priorities. First, to encourage inclusive political dialogue between the transitional federal institutions and other key Somali stakeholders. Second, to mobilize international support to help build the governance capacity of the transitional federal institutions and to provide development and humanitarian assistance to those institutions and to the Somali people. And third, and perhaps most urgently, to move ahead with the deployment of an African stabilization force in Somalia to help bolster the transitional federal government and to provide an opportunity for the Ethiopian forces to reduce their presence in Somalia. To advance those three objectives, so just to recap, first, encourage a process of inclusive political dialogue within Somalia, between the transitional institutions, and particularly other groups that did not feel well represented previously in those institutions. Secondly, to provide support to the transitional federal institutions and additional humanitarian development assistance to the Somali people. And third, to move ahead with the deployment of an African Union peace support mission that can bolster stability in Somalia, support the transitional governing institutions, and provide an opportunity for withdrawal of the Ethiopian forces. To advance that agenda, on January 5th, less than a week after the Islamic courts were routed, Kenyan Foreign Minister Raphael Tuju, Norway's Deputy Foreign Minister Raymond Johansen, and our own Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, Jendai Fraser, co-chaired a meeting of the International Contact Group for Somalia in Nairobi. This gathering demonstrated the depth of the international commitment to responding to the situation in Somalia through broad-based national dialogue and providing appropriate development, security, and humanitarian assistance. The contact group issued a communique at the meeting that recognized the historic opportunity now within the grasp of the Somali people as they seek a sustainable political solution based on the framework of the Transitional Federal Charter. The contact group also affirmed the importance of inclusive governance and additionally emphasized that funding to facilitate the deployment of a stabilization force in Somalia based on UN Security Council Resolution 1725 was urgent. This communique and other views expressed by the contact group members that day demonstrate the international community's unity on the question of how to move forward on Somalia. A follow-up meeting on February 9th of the contact group reaffirmed these points. So to take the three elements in turn, first on political dialogue, the U.S. believes that the key to long-term stability in Somalia lies in a process of inclusive dialogue and reconciliation, leading to the formation of an inclusive government of national unity within the framework of the Transitional Federal Charter. We see a role in the future of Somalia for all those who renounce violence and extremism, and we strongly believe that the TF Transitional Federal Government must reach out to groups that have previously been marginalized from the political process. To a great extent, this process will rely on the government's willingness to reach out and create an inclusive political dialogue. This remains the greatest challenge. President Yusuf, the Somali Transitional Federal Government President, has announced plans for a national reconciliation conference to be held in Somalia later this spring. We welcome this initiative. To be successful, however, it's clearly going to need careful preparation and a lot of informal dialogue among key Somali stakeholders, even prior to this national reconciliation conference. Secondly, in terms of advancing security and stability, it's important that the national dialogue move forward quickly to stabilize the situation, but further assistance is also going to be needed to support stability in this fragile, failed state. The U.S. has been working very closely with the African Union as it prepares for the deployment of a stabilization force. On January 19, the African Union Peace and Security Council endorsed deployment of a force to Somalia. Several African Union member countries have already expressed their intention to contribute troops or provide logistical support for this effort. Uganda came forward first, offering to deploy 1,600 troops based on the Security Council Resolution 1725. Ugandan President Museveni's initial offer has since been followed by other countries, including Ghana, Nigeria, and Burundi, expressing a desire to provide troops for this effort in Somalia. The United States is actively supporting deployment of this force, particularly the initial Ugandan contingent, by providing strategic transportation, equipment, and other logistical assistance. Our immediate support includes $2 million for transportation and $8 million for equipment for the Ugandan force. As I'm sure many of you know, an initial contingent of some 300 Ugandan troops deployed to Mogadishu yesterday, March 6th, and the Ugandan deployment continues. The African Union is leading and coordinating this peace support operation. Africans have developed considerable experience in conflict resolution and peacekeeping in recent years. Just as Nigeria took the lead in Liberia and South Africa did in Burundi, we're hopeful that Africans again will help one of their sister countries move beyond a period of strife and toward reconciliation. In taking a long view of Somalia's security, of course, the United States remains deeply troubled that foreign terrorists associated with al-Qaeda succeeded in establishing safe haven in Somalia. Somalia's continued exploitation by terrorist elements would threaten the stability of the entire Horn. Consequently, we continue to work with East African countries to build their capacity to counter terrorism and criminality that originates in Somalia. The U.S. government remains committed to neutralizing the threat that al-Qaeda poses to all Americans, Somalis, as well as citizens in neighboring African countries. The U.S. will continue to work with Somalis, regardless of clan, religious, or secular affiliation, to eliminate this common threat. Finally, I want to turn to efforts to support the transitional federal institutions. Support to these transitional institutions and the Somali people is critical to prevent spoilers and extremists from undermining stability. Given the absence of functioning governing institutions in Somalia for more than 15 years, building governance and security institutions will largely involve starting from scratch and will require significant external assistance. It's critically important that we and other partners help to enhance the governance capacity of the transitional institutions as well as governing authorities at the local and regional level. In this regard, U.S. assistance is aimed at supporting short-term, quick-impact, and high-visibility programs. This will be a critical element in building support for the transitional institutions and demonstrating to the Somali people that their government offers a means of improving their overall quality of life. At the January meeting of the International Contact Group on Somalia, Assistant Secretary for African Affairs Fraser signaled the U.S. government's intention to provide $40.5 million in new assistance for Somalia as a down payment toward further support. And indeed, more funding has already been identified. This contribution is a reflection of our commitment to Somalia's revitalization. Funds will be used, as I mentioned, in part for deployment of a peace support mission and to provide development assistance and humanitarian assistance for the Somali people. The Department of State has also requested $60 million in FY 2007 supplemental funding for Somalia. This includes $40 million for peacekeeping and $20 million in humanitarian assistance for those affected by the current humanitarian crisis in Somalia. So to sum up, the situation inside Somalia has changed a great deal over the past year or so. While conditions are highly fluid, on balance, we see developments as positive, representing a new opportunity for Somalis. The United States, along with our international partners, has made significant progress towards supporting the transitional institutions, encouraging reconciliation, and moving forward with rapid deployment of African peacekeeping forces. All of these measures add to stability and reduce the risk of Somalia remaining a failed state and a terrorist safe haven. This is going to be hard work. There will be setbacks along the way, but one important factor that continues to work strongly in our collective favor is this, that the Somali people are tired of war. They are yearning for stability, security, and representative governance. With the international community in an important supporting role, we're hopeful that Somalis will see more progress during the course of 2007. Thank you very much.
Well, we thank you for that comprehensive description. Very helpful. As you know, we end our meetings promptly at 10 after 7, which we will do again tonight. But for those of you who, and we will pause for a moment there, but those who would like to remain for additional questions, we'll go to 7:20. And we thank Mr. James Swan for that. Floor is open for questions. The first question is, would you comment upon the problem of AIDS with respect to Somalia? And then second and third, would you comment upon the worst case scenario that you can imagine for Somalia and the best case?
With respect, first of all, to HIV/AIDS, I don't know the exact figure for HIV/AIDS prevalence in Somalia. However, my understanding is that because in Somalia you have had relatively undeveloped transportation networks, you have a fairly traditional Muslim population, that as a consequence, HIV/AIDS rates are not the sort of problem there that you find in a lot of other places, where you tend to, since you asked the question, I presume you're following this issue fairly closely, but often where you tend to have much higher seroprevalence rates are in places where you have extensive transportation routes, often trucking routes, port cities, et cetera, where you're bringing in the virus. I'm sorry, I don't know the exact HIV seroprevalence rate in Somalia. but my understanding is that it certainly does not reach the level that is causing concern in many other countries in that region, particularly farther south in southern Africa. The best case and worst case scenarios. Well, I think, if you will, the best case scenario is one in which the elements that I've outlined as the key aspects of our policy are able to move forward and be successfully completed. And that would include successfully working with the Somali transitional federal government to persuade that government and other key stakeholders in Somalia that they need to engage in a very serious dialogue about the future of their country and ensure that key groups that have felt underrepresented in recent years in the governing institutions, in fact, are included. Who are those groups? They include some key elements of the Somali subclans in Mogadishu in particular. Although these groups do have individuals from those groups represented in the transitional federal institutions, they have felt that those individuals do not fully capture the interests of the subclans in Mogadishu. So what is important is for the transitional institutions to reach out to some of those key subclans, particularly in Mogadishu, as well as other elements such as the business community and some key civil society organizations to ensure that they're participating in the process. So the best case scenario on that aspect would be that that sort of outreach takes place. Ideally, that outreach would build further national support for those transitional institutions, which would enhance stability within the country. And this stability would be further enhanced, obviously, by the external support that we would begin to see from other donors and ourselves in terms of aiding the transitional institutions and the Somali population. And in addition to that, we would see the deployment of a robust African peace support operation that could further reinforce the transitional institutions, help reassure particularly the Mogadishu-based communities of their security, thwart any efforts by spoilers to attack those transitional institutions, and provide a basis for withdrawal of Ethiopian troops over time. Clearly the Ethiopians face something of a dilemma, and I think that they recognize that. Their presence in Somalia is important at the moment for security, but it's also clear that their long-term, a long-term and highly visible Ethiopian presence in Somalia could become a magnet for greater opposition, not only to the Ethiopians, who of course have historical differences with Somalia, but also to the transitional government that's benefiting from Ethiopian support. So I think, again, the best case would be to see that deployment provide opportunities for a gradual reduction of the Ethiopian presence. Worst case would be that those elements are not achieved, and that we see a failure of the transitional institutions to reach out, a lack of legitimacy of the transitional institutions, the inability of external peacekeepers to add further support to that, and perhaps even a gradual retreat to greater warlordism, and at worst, some return of Islamic courts' extremist elements, which have largely been removed from the equation at this point.
What inducements do you use to persuade warlords that have a comfortable situation in a region to join a national unity effort in which they'd have less influence?
Well, of course, there are some elements already that have been supportive of the transitional institutions from the beginning, and that provides at least a basis to work with. I mean, the inducements have to include indicating that they will be worse off if they continue to remain outside the fold of the transitional federal institutions. But I think that developments over the past year or so may have been a very useful wake-up call to the warlords. Of course, they were driven militarily out of Mogadishu. They were at risk of being in a situation where they had nothing at all. They were out of their own clan fiefdoms. They were essentially, they had retreated to Baidoa, where they were with the transitional governing institutions, but did not have their own independent base of support. And so I think that there may be an opening under these circumstances to underscore to them the fragility of trying to remain with a system that is effectively anarchic, and the benefits of moving towards something that is more structured and that would perhaps provide some greater security for them in the long term. But the question is, of course, very appropriate. It's difficult, and I think it underscores the challenges of trying to move ahead to restore some semblance of effective governance after a period of what's now approaching 20 years of tremendous anarchy. And I think as a consequence, it's one of the reasons why we need to seize this opportunity, because the expectations have been dashed so many times in Somalia that a failure to take advantage of openings, unfortunately, may condemn the situation to remain unresolved yet longer.
Would you comment on the dynamics of internal Somali politics and interests, and perhaps describe the interests of these various groups that have been identified by the questioner?
Well, again, all Somalis were represented at the conference that produced the transitional federal institutions in 2004. So there is an existing agreed framework for how to proceed. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this framework is for a transitional government. We need to keep in mind that what we're looking at immediately is trying to make an effective transitional government that will lead to a longer-term national government after 2009. So the debate has been much less over the actual nature of the transitional government and much more over its representativeness, much more over whether it is including, in fact, the right people to reflect the various clan elements within the country. So I think that's largely the basis in terms of moving forward on pulling together a national reconciliation process. Somaliland and Puntland pose somewhat different challenges. Puntland less so, because Puntland has never asserted its independence. It has sought to operate in a quasi-autonomous fashion, but has never sought to break with the rest of Somalia. And in fact, President Yusuf is from Puntland, and prior to his current role as president of the transitional federal government, was in fact the principal leader, or certainly one of them, within the Puntland administration. Somaliland poses a different set of challenges. The Somalilanders, up to this point, have indicated that they do not wish to return to southern Somalia. I think this is a situation in which, because of the anarchic circumstances that have prevailed in Somalia, it's been difficult even to come up with a path forward in terms of how you could reconcile Somalilanders' interests and the interests of those of the people of southern Somalia. I think that this is another reason why it's important that we come up with, that the Somalis come up with, a legitimate transitional governing structure in the South that could also then be a vehicle for further discussions with the Somaliland population as to the proper way forward.
Would you comment upon the role of external forces in Somalia, and specifically Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, and other nuances you may have picked up?
Let me actually answer the first question that you posed, which was, are we sending 1,500 troops to Somalia? If you mean by we, the United States, the answer is no. What I said, and I hope this was clear, but if it wasn't, let me repeat it, is that the Ugandans have committed to deploy 1,600 troops to Somalia under the rubric of an African Union peace support operation. And we are providing some support for their transportation and equipping of the Ugandans at the request of the African Union to support the deployment of this African Union force.
How complicated and extensive is the cluster of stakeholders who you want to incorporate into the system?
The Somali plan getting back to the question of what is the intent from the Somalis in terms of how to move forward, the transitional government's proposal is for a large national reconciliation conference that could include as many as 3,000 people. But clearly, but I think this speaks, first of all, to the fact that it's not so much for us to determine who the key stakeholders are. I mean, it's ultimately up to the Somali people and to the key Somali leaders to make those determinations. I think we will get ourselves in trouble trying to determine in some kind of very detailed fashion what specific sub-clan or what specific businessman or what specific individual needs to be included as part of this process. Ultimately, it's going to be up to them to make those decisions. I do want to say I think the 3,000 figure obviously is intended to be very broad, very inclusive, and offer the opportunity for the many different groups to include a variety of representatives from within each community.
Given the difficulty which has been demonstrated in economic reconstruction and perhaps other facets of nation building, what lessons has the State Department learned?
With respect to Somalia, first of all, I think it's important to remember that there's a broad international consensus, as I mentioned, in terms of how to move forward through the discussions of the International Somalia Contact Group on the need to move ahead with broad-based dialogue, support to the transitional institutions, and rapid deployment of this African Union peace support operation. We have a variety of other international partners who are interested in providing humanitarian development and reconstruction support in Somalia. Somalia is in many ways a mature humanitarian crisis. I mean, it's been the ambient levels of humanitarian suffering are already extraordinarily high in Somalia. And so there's an existing donor framework, for example, in Nairobi that has for many years been tracking developments in Somalia, is working with partner organizations, implementing partners on humanitarian response and reconstruction activities. So I think that there is an existing base there that provides us with a good foundation in terms of trying to move forward on this. But I would hope that I don't want to address perhaps the exact element of the question that you posed, but I think that in looking at the emphasis on broad-based dialogue among the Somalis, on the need for a Somali-driven process to be the primary component that will provide for stability in Somalia, I think that that's, if you will, the core element of what we're seeking to advance. And the other components that I've discussed in terms of providing support to the transitional institutions, in terms of supporting deployment of this African force, are intended to bolster that Somali-led process in terms of determining how to move forward.
Would you describe a model or a map for resuscitating a nation or nation building, and comment on how that's being used?
Yes, I mean, there have been many examples recently in Africa in terms of countries, perhaps not quite as back on its heels as Somalia, but nonetheless that were cases of serious failed states, or certainly states suffering from extraordinarily poor governance and capacity. I'm thinking even Congo-Kinshasa, Liberia, Sierra Leone, countries that even if they never were in a situation where there was no recognized government whatsoever, that government's writ didn't run very far outside the capital, and there were widespread areas of anarchy throughout the country. And in those cases, the model has tended to be, first of all, trying to get, again, the key stakeholders, whether it's the players in Liberia, whether it was the rebel forces, civil society organizations, political parties, and the government in Kinshasa together, to reach some determination among themselves about the way forward. That's, I think, a critical element. A second critical element has been international support, including outside peacekeeping operations. In some cases, those operations have at least begun with African involvement, ECOWAS's involvement in Liberia, for example, and in Sierra Leone, that have then transitioned to a UN force that has continued to provide support in those areas. I think another lesson has been the need for long-term and sustained international engagement with those countries, both in terms of providing financial and development assistance, but also in terms of continuing to work politically and diplomatically with the parties to try to keep them on the path toward recovery. But there's been a lot of work done on this, as you perhaps know. I mean, certainly the RAND Corporation and others have come up with extensive studies looking at comparative models of state rebuilding and reconstruction, everything from Haiti to East Timor, to Kosovo. I mean, there's a great deal of existing background material on these topics.
How large in population and territory is Somalia, and what are its important natural resources?
The population is about 8 million. Size, I think, about twice the size of California. It's got the longest coastline in Africa. Natural resources, there may be some there is some interest in possible oil exploration in certain areas of the country, although this has never really been developed. Fisheries has been an important resource. There have been some countries interested in banana cultivation. Traditionally, there was some agriculture, particularly between the Juba and Shabelle, in the Juba and Shabelle River valleys. And at one point, there was a quite sophisticated system of irrigation and drainage in those areas that has effectively collapsed. But in terms of major natural resources, or certainly of natural resources fueling conflict, that's not been the case in Somalia.
Given the worldwide efforts of the Chinese to establish a multiplicity of relationships, how do you see that playing out within East Africa? Are the Chinese going to be a help or a hindrance?
Well, the Chinese have certainly been supportive up to this point in, for example, the Security Council on resolutions related to Somalia, related to the deployment of a peace support operation. They welcomed a Somali delegation to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation last November. China was one of the first countries to which President Yusuf named an ambassador after assuming his position. So I think the Chinese may well have some useful influence. And as I say, certainly in the Security Council, they've been cooperative up to this point. We actually have in the Africa Bureau some meetings scheduled with our Chinese counterparts from Beijing on Friday, and we'll certainly be discussing with them areas of cooperation in the Horn and elsewhere on the continent.
Would you comment on al-Qaeda's presence in Somalia in terms of either cells or training camps, and also on the possibility of bin Laden's presence there?
To take the second one first, I don't have any information concerning a bin Laden presence there, so I can't corroborate that at all. With respect to the nature of the al-Qaeda cells, as I mentioned, as the Islamic courts movement emerged in Somalia in the late 1990s, and particularly after 2000, certain of the local Islamic courts in Mogadishu were harboring individuals affiliated with al-Qaeda. And those individuals were largely underground at that point. They were not circulating all that widely. And this is why we were greatly concerned when, with the expansion of the Islamic Courts Council, we began to see a much more open level of activity by some al-Qaeda-related individuals who began to circulate more widely in southern Somalia as the Islamic courts expanded their presence, etc. This obviously continues to be a priority for us in terms of trying to track them. We have obviously been cooperating with other countries in the region in trying to pursue these high-value targets. We think that the routing of the Council of Islamic Courts did cause many of these high-value targets to be forced out of a fairly comfortable environment that they were enjoying under the leadership of the Council of Islamic Courts, and that this may create some new opportunities.
Would you comment on the thesis that there are too many humanitarians in Africa? Interesting observation. And do you think there's anything to the thesis that this keeps the Africans from exercising their own initiative?
I think what we've seen, certainly in recent years, is that the African leadership is increasingly interested in exercising its own initiative. In many ways, the creation of the African Union as a successor organization to the Organization of African Unity, which of course had a very negative reputation for tolerating dictators and corruption and poor governance, whereas the African Union has enshrined in its charter its desire to see the continent better governed, less corrupt, and moving forward with economic development under its own initiative. And as part of what the African Union has moved forward with is the so-called New Partnership for African Development, which was spearheaded by some of the leading African nations, including South Africa, Algeria, Senegal, and Nigeria, to basically negotiate a new model of working with the international community. The idea being that the African countries themselves would seek to move forward in terms of improving their governance, improving their economic management, improving transparency and anti-corruption measures, and that they would themselves make determinations about progress through the so-called peer review mechanism, in which they would examine their own, their fellow African countries' progress in these areas. 2 countries have already gone through this peer review mechanism. I believe Ghana is one and Rwanda is the other. So I think that there is a growing demand, a desire on the part of African countries' leaders, led by some of the prominent ones like Thabo Mbeki of South Africa and Obasanjo of Nigeria, to take much greater control over the economic development model and their relations with the West. And frankly, we welcome that. We are very much eager to see our involvement in Africa as a partnership with African governments, as a partnership with the African Union. As the Secretary says, it means doing things with people, not doing things for people. That's part of her theme of transformational diplomacy, and I think it's very much a model for how we're trying to do business in Africa.
Well, for a most informative evening, and I think a wonderful overview of State Department positions, thank you very much.